So the first question he's asked is, when did you first see yourself as a leader? And, I played sports growing up, and I thought about this question, and I was captain of the soccer team. In high school, I was sixth man on the basketball team. So I moved from Park City to California after my freshman year. And that sophomore year, I played in a high school basketball team where in Fresno, we had like over 3,000 students at our high school. It was huge. And you definitely had taller, more athletic people than you did in Park City, little ski town, Utah. And it was fun because I've always had this kind of like coach mentality to the point where my basketball coach would get so mad because I would always make suggestions. I'm like, well, why would we do this? And why don't we do it like this? Like what? And then he got to the point where he started calling me Coach Sam. And they made a hat for me that I would wear at practices that literally said Coach Sam, Utah. I probably could find that hat somewhere. And just because it became the running joke is I loved kind of orchestrating and being like, okay, you guys, almost to the point where I enjoyed that more than having to start or having to be the all-star player. I was good, I just wasn't like the all-star center of the attention. I felt more excited about coaching and more excited about strategy, more excited about doing things more efficiently. And that's when I started to kind of really realize like, oh, I'm a leader. And that same year, I started the Gutterman is what we called that business, and I spray painted shirts, and I don't think I ever set up an LLC, but I got about 11 of my friends to convince them all to go paint addresses on the curbs. So that's why we called ourselves the Gutterman, because we were always spending our time in the gutter. And I would divvy out area. I had multiple stencil kits, and I managed the money and things like that. And I ran a little business, and I found that as I could help other people make a lot of money, I also started to make a lot of money. And I look at early days in my childhood. I'd host these cool epic skate parties. I'd bring all my cousins and friends, and we'd go roller skating or skateboarding at the skate park. And I loved hosting events. I loved creating experiences. I loved being the loud one in the room. And so that's kind of when I mean, thinking back to like early days is when my dad would always say, hey, you were born different than the rest of the kids. And I always would say, you're meant to be a great leader. And I gotta give my dad props, and my mom is because they almost like treated me different. I don't know, like I'm not trying to throw anything on other siblings. I have 6 siblings, but it was almost like they knew I was built differently and I saw things differently, and they said, you're destined to be a great leader. And that to me is probably almost what created this responsibility to say, okay, I can't let them down, and I need to live up to like what God's potential was for me on this earth. So the next question is, what are some of the greatest challenges you faced as a leader? Now, a lot, and I continue to face challenges. It's funny because a lot of people think like, oh, you're now like sit on the throne, you've got all your team below you, but reality is there's so much more emotional turmoil that comes through leadership than being the individual, being the rep, being the solopreneur. And I was just studying this book called The Infinite Atonement, and it talked about Christ when he atoned for our sins. He just brought a bigger cup. How did he withstand? How did he hold up all the sins and all the turmoil and all the agony that every soul pre and post Christ had ever gone through? And as we elevate our consciousness and as we expand our understanding, knowledge, spiritual, mental, physical capacities, we are able to bear more burden of others. Too often people can't lead themselves, and they can't seem to even withhold themselves, where leaders that lead big tribes, big organizations, big teams, they've been able to withstand so much individually and with a small team, then a big team, then a big organization, then a culture, and then a movement, that you look at like the hardships become even harder. Like the feeling, the opposition, the goods and the highs become even higher because you have bigger stages, bigger audiences, bigger paydays, and the lows become even lower. And that's an important principle to understand when you think of the biggest challenges. So a couple that stood out to me was when I would hire friends or people in my own network, I was always scared. I'm like, I don't want to hire a friend and then it goes south. And sometimes it does. Like sometimes they end up having to fire them, and you're like, hey, I love you as a human, but you suck as an employee. And those are hard conversations to have. And I'm a avoid conflict natural tendency. And when you have to let go of key people that are you built relationships with, and you've had to make some hard judgment calls, and you have to look at simple data, and you're like, dude, it's so cool having you around, but that doesn't mean I need to write you a paycheck every week. Like that, we can still be friends on the weekends, but I don't need to fund your life for not producing the return and value. And another one is bad ethics. I remember hiring certain people where you would think they would see it as stealing when you advance them money. And, I remember paying this guy $30,000. He came with all this promise, and I vetted it, and it was legit. And then 2 weeks later, he quits. And you're just like, well, I need my 30 grand back. And for some reason, he feels he's justified to keep the $30,000. And you're like, in what world, in what universe can you go to somebody, take $30,000 off the shelf, and then 2 weeks later be like, just kidding, and then keep the thing? You know what I mean? Like there's no fair transaction there. And that's happened to me countless times. And it's like the ethics and standard in which people see and do business has been shocking, and the deeper ingrained in companies and organizations and the way people make decisions is greed, fear. There's so much lack of responsibility. People just saying like, yeah, it was my fault. I will own up to that. Here you go. And then there's a lot of times where the people just don't own up to their own shit. It's like, it's frustrating. And the third thing that I found is the greatest challenge is just nobody gets you. When you're alone, having to jam on emails until midnight, or you're, dealing with like people yelling and telling you suck and that businesses sucks and this and the review of this, and there's times where you're just like, only I can feel this, and only I can take responsibility for this, and only I can fix this. So when you're like, hey, I look to delegate as much as I can. As a leader, it's like your time is your biggest currency. And when you have to spend certain time on money, or you have to spend certain time fixing a customer problem or complaint, or you have to spend so much time on something, and you're like, I wish I could call somebody and tell them to do it. You're just like, but as a leader, like there's certain things that you just have to pick up the scraps. And I think when I think of the biggest challenges, I think of the days where, I had to run billing, or I had to go update CRMs, and I had to go, recalculate a ton of these little transactions. And you're just like, I don't normally do this, and this is so hard, and it's not like what I want to be spending time on. And you just have to do the things that you don't like to do. And that is a huge challenge of leadership. And too often people see leader because they get a lot of the highlight, like the opposition here is the greatest. But they forget that they go through all the shit too. And money has been a challenge. Like when I started D2D, a lot of people don't realize I spent a year and a half paying other people's payroll and not taking a single dime, considering the fact that I'm the one that's people are paying to do all the work. I'm the one doing the consulting, the videos, the training, the products, and I didn't even get a check. And that was a challenge for me. And I've almost had to rewrite my brain the last year to be like, oh, it's okay, Sam, you can take a paycheck. And that's been a hard rewrite. It's just changing my own identity to keep up with like the evolution of a leader that I'm becoming. And that's common for people to run into.